Laughter echoed through the diner when Akram signed the deed to 40 acres of worthless, mosquito-infested mud. They called him a fool, a man throwing his life savings into a watery grave. That was before he broke the rusted chains of the sunken barn and silenced the town forever. Nobody in their right mind bought land in the deep basin of the Oakhaven Parish, especially not the treacherous stretch known to locals as the Drowning Acres. It was a miserable 40-acre expanse of rotting cypress trees, stagnant black water, and sinking mud that seemed to actively consume anything heavier than a bullfrog. Yet, Akram Daniels sat at the booth of Miller's Diner, a worn blue pen in his hand, meticulously signing a legally binding contract that transferred the entirety of his retirement savings into the swamp. Across the Formica table sat Wallace Gentry, a local real estate developer whose family had owned half the parish since the late 1900s. Wallace possessed the kind of loud, boisterous arrogance that only inherited wealth could buy. He wore a tailored linen suit that looked utterly ridiculous against the backdrop of the Greasy Spoon Diner, but he wore it like armor. A smug, predatory grin stretched across his tanned face as he watched Akram carefully ink his signature onto the final page of the deed. "You are officially a landowner, Artie," Wallace declared, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the regulars at the counter overheard. "I gotta say, I didn't think you had it in you. 40 acres of prime Louisiana bog. What's the grand plan? Going to farm mosquitoes? Build a luxury resort for the snapping turtles?" A chorus of chuckles erupted from the men in dirty overalls hunched over their coffees at the counter. Akram ignored them. He was a man of 52, possessing a quiet, unassuming demeanor, with graying hair and hands calloused from 30 years as a structural surveyor for the state. He didn't look like a visionary, and he certainly didn't look like a man with a hidden agenda. He simply folded the deed, slid it into a battered manila envelope, and looked Wallace dead in the eye. "It has potential, Wallace. That's all you need to know," Akram replied softly, his tone devoid of any irritation. Wallace let out a sharp bark of laughter. "Potential? Did you hear that, boys? The swamp has potential. Listen, Akram, I sold you that useless tract for a song because I like you, and because my accountant told me it was a liability. But I feel a moral obligation to warn you, that land is cursed. Nobody's set foot near the center of it since the 1940s. It's quicksand, methane pockets, and water moccasins. You'll be begging me to take it back for pennies on the dollar by Christmas." Akram stood up, leaving a $5 bill on the table for his black coffee. "I won't be selling it back, Wallace. Have a good afternoon." Walking out into the suffocating humidity of the Louisiana afternoon, Akram climbed into his 10-year-old Ford F-150. As he turned the ignition, his chest tightened. The bravado he had displayed in the diner was a thin veneer masking a terrifying reality. He had just liquidated his entire 401k through Fidelity Investments, drained the joint savings account he shared with his wife, and even taken out a high-interest personal loan from Chase Bank to cover the closing costs. He was financially ruined if this gamble failed. When Akram arrived home to their modest, single-story house on the outskirts of town, his wife, Beatrice, was waiting for him at the kitchen island. Beatrice was a pragmatic woman, an auditor for a regional logistics company. She lived her life in spreadsheets, risk assessments, and calculated margins. The sight of the manila envelope in Akram's hands made the color drain from her face. "You actually did it, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Tell me, you didn't give Wallace Gentry our future, Akram." Akram placed the envelope on the granite counter like it was a fragile artifact. "B, I know how it looks on paper. I know the math doesn't make sense to you right now, but you have to trust me. I spent 6 months surveying the perimeter on my days off. There is something out there." "A swamp!" Beatrice shouted, slamming her hand against the countertop. "There is a swamp out there!" "Akram, I looked at the topographic maps from the United States Geological Survey. It's a sinkhole. It floods every spring. The property taxes alone will bleed us dry, and we have a second mortgage on this house with Wells Fargo that we can barely afford. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking about the anomaly," Akram said quietly, pulling a rolled-up, heavily annotated aerial photograph from his back pocket. He spread it flat over the counter, pointing a calloused finger at a dense cluster of trees near the center of the tract. "Look here, this isn't just random overgrowth. See this subtle elevation? And this square shadow right here in the center of the deep water? That's not natural topography. That's a structure. A large one." Beatrice stared at the blurry gray square on the satellite image. "A structure? It's probably an old moonshine still or a rusted hunting blind. You jeopardized our retirement for a shack in the mud? It's a barn, B. A massive, reinforced steel barn. I found old county zoning records from 932 that were misfiled under a different parish line. A man named Silas Vandergrift. Don't start with the local legends, Akram, Beatrice interrupted, pinching the bridge of her nose. Vandergrift was a notorious bootlegger and a thief. He disappeared 80 years ago. Everyone knows the stories. If he had anything valuable left, the feds, or the local scavengers, would have dug it out of that mud decades ago. They couldn't, Akram insisted, his eyes gleaming with a feverish intensity. Because the topography changed. The Army Corps of Engineers rerouted the spillway in 1945, flooding the Vandergrift Basin. The water level rose 8 feet. That barn was swallowed by the swamp, completely inaccessible unless you know exactly how to navigate the subterranean bedrock. I found a path, a solid ridge of limestone that runs just beneath the muck. If I can drain just enough of the surface water using a high-capacity diesel pump, I can reach those doors. Beatrice looked at her husband, seeing a terrifying obsession taking root. And what if you reach it, and it's empty? What if it's just rusted tractor parts and rotten wood? We lose everything, Akram. Everything. I've calculated the risks, Akram said, though his voice lacked its usual surveyor's certainty. I just need time. And a little faith. The first 3 months on the Drowning Acres were a masterclass in misery. Akram quickly realized that the swamp was not merely a passive environment, it was an aggressive, living entity that fought his intrusion at every turn. His plan was theoretically sound but practically agonizing. He had leased a heavy-duty, commercial-grade Godwin diesel water pump from a regional equipment supplier. The daily rental fee was astronomical, biting deep into the small reserve of cash he had left from his Chase Bank loan. His objective was to pump the standing water from the central basin into an adjacent drainage canal, temporarily exposing the hidden limestone ridge that led to the sunken structure. Every morning before dawn, Akram waded into the black, foul-smelling water, wearing chest-high neoprene waders that offered little protection against the oppressive heat. The Louisiana summer was brutal, turning the swamp into a humid pressure cooker. Swarms of horseflies and mosquitoes descended upon him mercilessly. The mud sucked at his boots with the strength of wet concrete, turning a 50-yard walk into an hour-long ordeal of physical exhaustion. The financial strain was immediate and terrifying. By late July, the letters began arriving in their mailbox. Red-stamped envelopes from Capital One, urgent notices from utility companies, and polite but firm voicemails from the loan officers at the local credit union. Beatrice handled the mail in grim silence, organizing the impending doom into neat, color-coded folders on her desk. She stopped asking Akram about his progress, withdrawing into a shell of cold, resentful anxiety. They ate dinner in silence. The only sound, the hum of the air conditioner and the distant, rhythmic chugging of the Godwin pump echoing from the swamp. Wallace Gentry made a habit of driving his pristine silver Range Rover to the edge of the property line once a week. He would park on the gravel shoulder, roll down his window, and watch Akram struggle in the distance. One particularly grueling Tuesday, the pump's intake hose clogged with a dense mass of rotting vegetation. Akram spent 3 hours submerged to his shoulders in the murky water, wrestling with the heavy rubber hose, blindly clearing the debris with numb, bleeding fingers. When he finally dragged himself onto the muddy bank, gasping for air and covered in black slime, Wallace was waiting for him. "You look like hell, Artie," Wallace called out, leaning against the hood of his luxury SUV, sipping from a Yeti thermos. "I hear Beatrice is working overtime down at the logistics firm just to keep the lights on. It's a crying shame watching a good man drown in his own stubbornness." Akram sat on a rotting log, spitting out a mouthful of gritty water. He didn't have the energy to exchange insults. "What do you want, Wallace?" "I want to offer you a lifeline," Wallace said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "I know about the Chase loan, Akram. In a small town, banking secrets are just gossip with numbers. You are bleeding out. Now I have a heart. I'm willing to buy this miserable pit back from you. I'll give you 20 cents on the dollar. It won't cover your debt, but it'll stop the hemorrhaging. You can declare bankruptcy and start over." Akram stared at the muddy water swirling around his boots. For a fleeting second, the exhaustion in his bones screamed at him to accept. His muscles were torn, his bank accounts were empty, and his marriage was fracturing. But then he looked back toward the center of the swamp. The water level had dropped. It was only by about 2 feet, but it was enough. The tops of the rusted corrugated steel roof of the barn were now visible, poking through the duckweed like the spine of a metallic beast. "The price is $50 million, Wallace," Akram croaked, his voice raw from the swamp gas. Wallace frowned, his amusement vanishing. "You've lost your mind. $50 million for a toxic puddle? That's my price. If you don't want to pay it, get off my land." Wallace scoffed, climbing back into his Range Rover. "I'll buy it at the foreclosure auction next month, you delusional old fool." As Wallace drove away, Akram forced his aching body back up. He walked toward the edge of the receding waterline, following the subtle, solid feeling of the limestone ridge beneath his boots. The closer he got to the center, the more the swamp seemed to yield its secrets. Just a few yards from the rusted roof of the barn, his boot struck something hard that wasn't stone. He reached down into the knee-deep muck and pulled up a heavy, encrusted object. Walking back to his truck, he used a bottle of clean drinking water to wash the mud away. It was a heavy, solid brass padlock, stamped with the unmistakable insignia of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Attached to it was a piece of petrified, oil-soaked canvas. Akram's heart hammered against his ribs. The Pinkerton Agency hadn't just guarded payroll trains and bank vaults. In the 1920s and 30s, they were hired by the most powerful industrial tycoons to protect high-value, off-the-books assets. You didn't put a Pinkerton lock on a barn full of hay. When Akram brought the heavy brass lock home and placed it on Beatrice's desk, she stared at it for a long time. She traced the engraved lettering with her finger. "This is real," she said softly, looking up at him. The coldness in her eyes had momentarily cracked, replaced by a glimmer of the shared curiosity they used to have. "I'm close, B. The water is low enough. I need 3 more days of pumping, and I can reach the main doors. But I need you to trust me. Don't pay the mortgage this month. Give me the last $3,000 we have in the emergency fund. I need to rent an industrial winch and an acetylene torch." Beatrice closed her eyes. The auditor in her was screaming to stop this madness. But the wife in her, the woman who had watched her husband slowly break himself in the mud for a dream, made a different calculation. 3 days, Akram," she said, her voice shaking. "If you don't find something in 3 days, we hand the keys to the bank and we walk away." Late August brought a brutal dry spell to Louisiana. The humidity was suffocating, thick enough to chew, but the lack of rain was a blessing. The Godwin pump had run continuously for 72 hours, spewing thousands of gallons of black water into the adjacent canals. By the morning of the 3rd day, the limestone ridge was fully exposed, forming a slick, muddy causeway that led directly into the heart of the drowning acres. At the end of the causeway stood the structure. It was much larger than it had appeared on the satellite imagery. It was a massive, industrial-grade warehouse, constructed from thick, riveted plates of corrugated steel that had oxidized into a deep, blood-brown rust. It looked entirely out of place in the natural chaos of the swamp, like a sunken battleship resting on the ocean floor. Akram maneuvered a rented, heavy-treaded Bobcat skid steer loader down the limestone path. The machine slipped and slid on the treacherous surface, but the bedrock held its weight. Strapped to the front bucket were a high-tension worn winch, 2 massive oxygen acetylene tanks, and heavy-duty bolt cutters. Beatrice had insisted on coming. She wore rubber boots and old jeans, holding tightly to the roll cage of the Bobcat as they slowly crawled toward the structure. The smell of decay and stagnant water was overwhelming, but neither of them spoke. The tension was too thick. They reached the front of the warehouse. The main entry was a pair of colossal steel sliding doors, heavily reinforced with iron crossbeams. They were chained shut with links the size of a man's fist, secured by 3 massive rusted padlocks. The bottom 2 feet of the doors were still submerged in thick, viscous muck. "It looks impenetrable," Beatrice whispered, staring up at the imposing facade. "Akram, those chains, they look like they belong on a ship's anchor." "They wanted to make sure nobody got in," Akram said, unloading the acetylene torch equipment, and more importantly, they wanted to make sure whatever was inside didn't wash away in a flood. He fired up the torch, the blue flame roaring to life. For the next 2 hours, the swamp echoed with the sharp, hissing crackle of burning metal. The rust and scale were so thick that the torch struggled to bite through the hardened steel of the chains. Akram's arms ached, sweat pouring into his eyes, but he refused to stop. Sparks showered down into the damp mud, hissing as they extinguished. Finally, with a heavy clank, the last padlock gave way, dropping into the muck. The chains unraveled, falling loosely against the steel doors. But the doors were seized solid, fused together by 80 years of rust, humidity, and the crushing weight of the shifting mud. Akram hooked the heavy steel cable of the worn winch to a rusted iron loop on the right side door, anchoring the other end to the heavy frame of the Bobcat. "Stand back, B!" Akram yelled, climbing into the operator's seat of the loader. He threw the machine into reverse and engaged the winch. The engine of the Bobcat roared, its heavy tracks spinning and slipping on the limestone, kicking up roosters of black mud. The steel cable pulled taut, humming like a massive guitar string under extreme tension. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. The cable looked like it was about to snap, which would have sent lethal shrapnel flying in all directions. Then, a deafening screech of tearing metal split the air. It sounded like a train derailing. The right door jerked outward, breaking the seal of rust and mud. Akram kept the throttle wide open, dragging the massive steel door open inch by agonizing inch. A rush of stale, trapped air escaped from the dark interior, carrying a bizarre, mechanical scent that overpowered the smell of the swamp, the distinct, lingering odor of old motor oil, canvas, and preserved rubber. Akram killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. He grabbed a high-powered LED flashlight from the cab and walked up to the threshold, Beatrice right behind him, gripping his elbow. He shined the beam into the cavernous darkness. The light cut through a haze of floating particulate, illuminating the interior. It was astonishingly dry. The warehouse had been built on a slightly elevated concrete slab, and the riveted steel walls had somehow maintained a watertight seal against the decades of flooding. As Akram swept the beam from left to right, the breath hitched in his throat. "My God," Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was not empty. It was not filled with rusted tractor parts or bootlegger moonshine barrels. Lined up in perfect, immaculate rows were dozens of large, mysterious shapes covered in heavy, dust-caked canvas tarps. But it was what stood in the center of the room that made Akram drop to his knees. Sitting untouched on a raised wooden platform was a vintage automobile, its chrome still catching the harsh glare of the flashlight. But it wasn't just any car. Akram, a lifelong appreciator of automotive history, recognized the sweeping, teardrop fenders, the riveted dorsal seam running down the center of the body, and the aggressive, low-slung stance. It was a 1938 Bugatti Type 57 SC Atlantic, one of the most legendary, rarest, and most valuable automobiles on the face of the earth. Automotive historians widely believed that only 4 were ever built, and one, the infamous La Voiture Noire, had vanished without a trace in 1940 as the Germans invaded France. Akram's hands trembled as he stepped closer, the flashlight beam illuminating the dusty, jet-black paint. The car was pristine, sitting on deflated tires, perfectly preserved in a swampy time capsule for nearly a century. "Akram," Beatrice stammered, pointing a shaking finger toward the back wall. "Look behind it." Akram dragged his eyes away from the Bugatti and directed the beam deeper into the warehouse. Behind the rows of tarp-covered vehicles, which Akram could now identify by their silhouettes as vintage 1930s Indian and Harley-Davidson motorcycles, stood a massive, floor-to-ceiling bank vault door built directly into the reinforced back wall of the barn. The dial was heavy brass, and stamped directly into the thick steel above the locking mechanism was the logo of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, accompanied by the year 1933. Akram realized then that Silas Vandergrift had not just been a bootlegger. He had been a custodian, a man who hid things for incredibly powerful people when the world went to war. Suddenly, the harsh crunch of gravel and the loud revving of an engine broke their trance. The sound was coming from outside, down the limestone causeway. Akram extinguished the flashlight and spun around, peering through the gap in the massive doors. Heading straight toward them, navigating the narrow, muddy path with reckless speed, was Wallace Gentry's silver Range Rover, followed closely by 2 lifted Chevrolet Silverado pickup trucks filled with men. Wallace hadn't come to gloat this time. He had been watching the water levels too, and he wasn't going to let the swamp's secret slip through his fingers. Headlights pierced the heavy swamp fog as Wallace Gentry's caravan halted at the edge of the limestone causeway. The arrogant developer killed the engine of his silver Range Rover, the doors swinging open to reveal not just Wallace, but 4 imposing men in heavy boots and hunting jackets. They carried heavy steel pry bars and heavy-duty maglite flashlights, their expressions hardened by the promise of a lucrative payout. Wallace marched down the slippery, exposed bedrock, his designer boots sinking into the residual sludge. He stopped 10 yards from the rusted warehouse doors, his jaw dropping as the beams of his men's flashlights caught the flawless, preserved curvature of the 1938 Bugatti Type 57 SC Atlantic resting inside. The sneer on his face dissolved into a mask of naked, unadulterated greed. "I knew it," Wallace breathed, his voice trembling with a manic energy. "I knew that crazy old bootlegger hid his fortune out here. And you, Akram, you arrogant peasant, you did all the heavy lifting for me." Akram stepped out of the Bobcat, planting his boots firmly in the mud. He gripped a heavy iron wrench in his right hand. Beatrice stood just behind him, her hands shaking but her eyes burning with an intense, protective fire. "You are trespassing on private property, Wallace," Akram stated, his voice echoing loudly against the corrugated steel walls of the structure. "The deed is in my name. This land, and everything on it, belongs to Beatrice and me. Turn around and drive away." Wallace let out a sharp, mocking laugh that bounced off the cypress trees. "Private property? Akram, You are $50,000 in debt to Chase Bank, and you missed your last mortgage payment. My lawyer filed a lien against this property at the courthouse this morning. I am taking possession of this land to satisfy your debts. Now, step aside before Clayton here removes you by force. A massive man in a flannel shirt took a threatening step forward, smacking a pry bar against the palm of his hand. Beatrice pulled out her smartphone, the screen glowing brightly in the dim light. I am recording you, Wallace, and I have already dialed the Louisiana State Police. They are on their way. If your men take one more step, it's not just trespassing, it's armed robbery and assault. I will see you rot in a federal penitentiary. Wallace hesitated, his eyes darting to the glowing lens of the phone. He was a wealthy man, accustomed to bullying his way through local bureaucracy, but a recorded assault charge was a different beast entirely. His mind raced, calculating the angles. Then a wicked, triumphant smile spread across his face. You want to play hardball, Artie? Wallace sneered. Fine. Clayton Mitchell, go back to the drainage canal. Take sledgehammers to that Godwin diesel pump. Smash the intake valves and cut the fuel lines. Akram's heart plummeted into his stomach. No! Wallace! You don't understand what you're doing! I know exactly what I'm doing, Wallace countered, stepping back as his men sprinted toward the distant sound of the chugging water pump. You found a nice little cave, Akram, but you forgot that it only exists because you're artificially holding back the tide. Without that pump, the drowning acres will reclaim this basin in less than an hour. That vault, those cars, they will be buried under 10 feet of toxic mud and water again. If I can't have it today, neither can you. I'll just buy the flooded land at foreclosure next month and bring my own excavators. A few moments later, the steady, rhythmic roar of the Godwin pump sputtered, choked, and died. The sudden silence in the swamp was deafening, broken only by the distant, horrifying sound of rushing water. The makeshift dam at the drainage canal had been breached. The black waters of the swamp were returning. You're a monster, Beatrice whispered, watching the dark liquid already beginning to seep over the edges of the limestone causeway. I'm a businessman, Wallace corrected, climbing back into his Range Rover. Enjoy your swim, Akram. Try not to drown with your treasure. As the trucks reversed and sped away, slipping and sliding on the gravel shoulder, Akram spun around to face the warehouse. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped his chest. The water level was rising with terrifying speed. The basin acted like a funnel, and thousands of gallons of displaced swamp water were violently rushing back to their natural resting place. Get in the Bobcat, Akram shouted, sprinting toward the massive steel doors. We have to seal it. If the water breaches the threshold, it will destroy the vehicles and flood the vault. Beatrice scrambled into the cab of the loader. The muddy water was already lapping at the soles of Akram's boots. He grabbed the heavy steel chains that he had cut earlier, desperately trying to thread them back through the iron loops of the doors. Pull the door shut. Use the winch, Akram commanded. Beatrice engaged the heavy machinery. The Bobcat strained, its tracks slipping on the increasingly submerged limestone. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive rusted door began to slide back into place. The grinding of steel on steel was deafening. Akram stood knee-deep in the rising muck, physically pushing against the corrugated metal to help guide it into its track. With a resounding crash, the doors slammed together. Akram swiftly wrapped the heavy chains around the crossbeams, securing them with a heavy-duty carabiner from his tool belt. It wasn't waterproof, but the original structural seal of the building might hold just long enough to keep the interior dry if the pressure didn't buckle the walls. By the time they climbed up onto the roof of the Bobcat to escape the rising tide, the limestone causeway was completely submerged. The dark, foul-smelling water had risen 3 feet in a matter of minutes, swallowing the lower half of the warehouse doors. They were marooned on a tiny island of yellow machinery in the middle of a hostile, rising sea. Akram pulled a heavy, waterproof Motorola satellite phone from his utility belt, a remnant from his days running deep swamp surveying crews. He didn't call the local sheriff. The local authorities were too intertwined with Wallace Gentry's money. He dialed a number he had saved years ago during a joint federal infrastructure project. FBI New Orleans field office. A crisp voice answered. My name is Akram Daniels, Akram said, his voice remarkably steady despite the chaotic swirling waters beneath him. I am reporting an attempted armed robbery and the sabotage of industrial equipment at the Oak Haven Basin. Furthermore, I need to report the discovery of a sealed Federal Reserve vault dating back to 1933, containing unknown assets, alongside a 1938 Bugatti Type 57 SC Atlantic. Send the art crime team. Send everyone. The dawn broke over the drowning acres, not with the gentle chirp of swamp birds, but with the deafening, rhythmic thumping of twin-engine rotor blades. A massive Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter, bearing the insignia of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, hovered above the submerged basin, casting a violent downdraft that whipped the swamp water into a frenzy. Akram and Beatrice, shivering and covered in dried mud, were airlifted from the roof of the submerged Bobcat by a rescue diver. By the time their boots touched the solid asphalt of the nearby state highway, the perimeter of the swamp was a fortress of flashing red and blue lights. Over 24 heavily armed federal agents, Louisiana State Police cruisers, and environmental engineers had descended upon the property. Wallace Gentry was already in handcuffs. He was pinned against the hood of a state trooper's cruiser, screaming obscenities as an FBI agent read him his rights. Wallace's arrogance had blinded him to the severity of his actions. Destroying commercial equipment and attempting to lay claim to Federal Reserve property elevated his crimes from a local misdemeanor to major federal felonies. An agent in a tailored suit, flashing a badge identifying him as Special Agent Harrison of the FBI's Art Crime Team, approached Akram with a thermos of hot coffee. "Mr. Daniels, you have caused quite a stir in Washington this morning," Harrison said, his eyes scanning the flooded basin. "We brought our own industrial pumps. The Army Corps of Engineers is setting up a temporary cofferdam as we speak. We will have the water cleared in 3 hours. But I have to ask, are you absolutely certain about the Federal Reserve stamp?" "I saw it with my own eyes," Akram replied, wrapping a thermal blanket tightly around Beatrice's shoulders. 1933, New York branch. Agent Harrison's expression tightened. 1933 was the year President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, criminalizing the possession of monetary gold by any individual or corporation. Millions in bullion went missing during the confiscation period, hidden by wealthy industrialists who refused to surrender their wealth. If what you found is what I think it is, you are standing on top of one of the greatest historical discoveries of the century. The next few hours were a blur of military precision. Massive, high-capacity turbine pumps drained the basin in record time. As the water receded, a team of federal safecrackers and historical archivists, flown in directly from the Smithsonian Institution, waded through the muck toward the rusted doors. Akram and Beatrice were escorted inside the damp, cavernous warehouse. The Bugatti still sat on its wooden platform, a silent, immaculate witness to the chaos. The safecrackers set to work on the massive Federal Reserve vault built into the back wall. It took 2 hours of precise drilling, ultrasonic imaging, and the manipulation of heavy brass tumblers. Finally, a heavy, metallic clack echoed through the warehouse. Agent Harrison stepped forward, gripping the heavy steel wheel of the vault. With a heave, the massive door swung open on perfectly balanced, oiled hinges. A collective gasp swept through the room. The interior of the vault was lined with reinforced steel shelving. Stacked upon those shelves were hundreds of heavy, wooden crates, each stamped with the seal of the United States Assay Office. Agent Harrison carefully pried the lid off the nearest crate. The harsh beam of his tactical flashlight reflected off rows upon rows of solid gold bars. "Mother of God," an archivist whispered, adjusting his glasses. But it wasn't just gold. On the higher shelves rested perfectly sealed, climate-controlled cylindrical tubes. When the archivists opened them, they found rolled canvases. They unrolled a small, vibrant oil painting, revealing the unmistakable, masterful brushstrokes of Johannes Vermeer, a piece labeled "The Concert," looted from a wealthy European family before the war and smuggled to America for safekeeping, only to vanish into Vandergrift's hidden swamp fortress. The sheer magnitude of the discovery was incomprehensible. But amidst the awe, the practical reality of the situation came into sharp focus. "So," Beatrice said, her voice shaking as she looked at Agent Harrison, "does the government just take it all? Did we risk everything for a pat on the back?" Agent Harrison smiled, a rare, genuine expression. "Mrs. Daniels, the federal government reclaims the gold bullion as it was technically federal property under the 1933 Act. However, under the parameters of the Salvage Act and federal treasure trove precedents, the finder of abandoned property is entitled to a substantial finder's fee, typically a percentage of the recovered asset's value. The gold alone is estimated to be worth north of $400 million. Your finder's fee will comfortably place you in the highest tax bracket in this country." He gestured toward the center of the warehouse. Furthermore, the Bugatti, the vintage motorcycles, and the artwork were not federal property. The shell companies that Vandergrift used to hide these assets dissolved 80 years ago with no surviving heirs. After a mandatory probate period, a federal judge will likely award full ownership of those vehicles and any non-federal artifacts directly to you. Akram looked at the 1938 Bugatti Type 57 SC Atlantic. the last one to sell at auction, went for over $30 million. He then looked at his wife, whose eyes were filled with tears of absolute shock and overwhelming relief. The crushing weight of their debt, the sleepless nights, the grueling labor in the toxic mud, it was all over. 6 months later, the atmosphere at Miller's Diner was entirely different. The loud, boisterous laughter of the locals had been replaced by a quiet, reverent murmuring whenever Akram and Beatrice walked through the door. The town of Oakhaven had been transformed. Wallace Gentry's real estate empire had completely collapsed. Facing a mountain of federal indictments for sabotage, assault, and attempting to defraud the federal government, his assets were frozen and his properties were seized. He was currently awaiting trial in a federal detention center in Baton Rouge. Akram had kept his promise. He didn't sell the drowning acres. Instead, he used a fraction of his massive newfound wealth to hire top-tier environmental engineering firms. They dredged the toxic mud, stabilized the limestone bedrock, and transformed the treacherous swamp into a beautiful, sprawling wildlife preserve, open to the public. The massive rusted warehouse was meticulously preserved and converted into a private museum. In the center of that museum, resting on a polished granite floor beneath dramatic gallery lighting, sat the crown jewel of their discovery. Akram had refused to sell the Bugatti. Instead, he had contracted the world's finest automotive restorers to bring the magnificent machine back to life. The engine block was rebuilt, the supercharger meticulously cleaned, and the electron bodywork polished to a mirror shine. On a crisp Sunday afternoon, the deep, guttural roar of an inline-8 engine shattered the tranquility of the Louisiana countryside. Akram Daniels sat behind the wooden steering wheel, shifting the heavy mechanical gears as the priceless, jet-black automobile cruised down the country highway. Beatrice sat beside him, the wind catching her hair, a bright, unburdened smile on her face. They drove past the sprawling wetlands they now owned, past the sign that welcomed visitors to the Oakhaven Historical Preserve, and left the laughter of the diner far behind them in the dust. They had gambled everything on a flooded piece of wasteland, trusting in a buried secret when the rest of the world called them fools. In the end, the swamp had not drowned them, it had elevated them to kings. Did this incredible discovery leave you completely speechless? Hidden history and buried fortunes are out there waiting to be found by those who refuse to give up. We bring you the most thrilling real-life treasure hunts, historical mysteries, and unbelievable stories of everyday people striking it rich against all odds. Hit that like button if you enjoyed Akram's amazing vindication. Share this video with your fellow history buffs, and please do not forget to subscribe for more epic, amazing adventures.
Hi, my name is Winjin, the owner and manager of Coyote Frontier Hearts. After watching the video, they laughed at his swampy land until he forced open the rusted barn and found the truth. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? The part that stayed with me most was Akram's quiet determination. Even when everyone doubted him, he kept trusting his instincts and refused to give up. It's a reminder that patience, careful thinking, and perseverance can sometimes reveal opportunities that others never even notice. What was your favorite moment in the story? If you had been in Akram's shoes, would you have taken the risk or played it safe? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. One lesson I'm taking away is not to judge something too quickly, just because it looks ordinary on the surface. If this story resonated with you, feel free to like the video. And if you enjoy stories about inheritance, hidden secrets, and unexpected discoveries, I'd be happy to have you subscribe to Coyote Frontier Hearts.